dreary night of November. Welcome, Franken readers, to Sundays with Frankenstein. And I call on you, spirits of the dead, and on you, wandering ministers of vengeance, to aid and conduct me in my work. That should be like an invocation for every show I do to start with, right? Franken readers, this is episode 13 of Sundays with Frankenstein. We'll be covering volume 3, chapter 6, and the first half of chapter 7 of the 1818 edition today. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach in Philadelphia. And joining me today are the Ghoul Guides, Mary Going and Dr. Lauren Nixon. Welcome back, you two. Too long.
Hello. I know, it feels like ages.
Yeah, like, you know, we had a reshuffle, like, so we were out of that cycle. And so I'm so happy to have you guys back. Anything new in the Ghoul Guide world since I've last seen? It's been almost a month, right?
Yeah, well, the reason we were supposed to be rescheduling was that my sister was getting married, but unfortunately, it's been postponed again until July. But England is finally inching its way to a more free and COVID safe society.
Yeah.
So this week we could finally go outside, which has been really delightful because it's been sunny here. But I have mostly just been working, I think I've mentioned this before, I work part-time in healthcare, and the doctor's surgery that I work for is very big and we do a lot of research. So we're actually a vaccine rollout centre. So we have been delivering hundreds of thousands of vaccines to the British public. So steadily getting there.
Have you been vaccinated yet?
I have. I am fully vaccinated. I got my first dose in January.
Okay, good.
And we were one of the places that helped develop the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. So I have had nothing to do with the actual vaccine development. My job was keeping the actual, the health centre running for the 40-odd thousand patients while everybody else was doing the important work of developing the vaccine.
I'm sure you were doing important work too. And what you're doing. So,
but yeah, it's not a nice situation to be in, but it's been really fantastic to see how quickly we've. Usually, research takes a really long time.
Yeah.
So it's been really fantastic to see how quickly and efficiently we've been able to develop a vaccine, get it rolled out. So it has been really nice to be a part of something positive in such a negative year. Right, so that's been my life.
Mary, what's been new with you in the last month?
Well, as you can see, I'm in a different space.
You are. I was I'm wondering, did you just move the camera or are you in a different space?
No. So since the last show, I had my eviction notice for my flat, and I've since moved. Still in the same building, but yeah, different flat. So I've moved, but brought some friends with me as well. I also I feel like it's been so long and it's only been a month, but I gave a paper about Buffy and Supernatural, which I feel like I should plug here in case anyone's interested. It's about Christ figures and chosen ones in Buffy and Supernatural. So I gave it at a conference called Divine Bodies, but I've also put it on our Ghoul Guides YouTube channel. So if anyone is interested in learning about chosen ones, Christ figures, and questioning like who gets to be chosen and who gets to be divine in Buffy and Supernatural, you can check that out on our YouTube channel. And also I feel like I should also plug, I'm organizing a conference on Lovecraft Country. So if anyone is a fan of the show and wants to delve into the histories of America, politics, all this kind of stuff, and specifically the show, it's a half-day symposium taking place on May the 20th. Tickets are free. It goes from 12 to 6 p.m. BST, which I think is 7 to 1 Eastern time.
5 hours. I think you're 5 hours behind us.
Yeah,
quite
5
early.
hours behind. Yeah.
And then like ridiculously early on the West Coast.
Yeah.
But you can find all the details for that. I think there's some on the Sheffield Gothic blog, and then also the Centre for the History of the Gothic website.
If you have a link handy now to throw in the chat at some point,
I
that'd be
will
great, because I don't have that link. But just as we're going on today, if you have it handy,
I
if
will
not,
find that now.
we'll definitely post it on our Facebook group as well.
Amazing.
So great, you guys have been very busy. I have been too, and I have a new drink today. And
I like the color of this one.
Yeah, it's nice and pink. I mean,
Yes.
it's part of this damson plum gin, which is just
brilliant.
lovely, and it's sweet and delicious. But this is, and I've appropriately named it Victor's Honeymoon, and it's the damson gin and triple sec, and then a little orgeat syrup, which it's just an almond syrup, but you know, it's fancy if you call it orgeat syrup. And I have this El Guapo brand, muy guapo, and a little dash. Where our original recipe said a half ounce of apple cider vinegar, and that's the bitter part of Victor's Honeymoon, I think.
The bitter aftertaste.
Yeah, but I've actually just thrown a dash in. I thought the half ounce was a little too much, and a little nutmeg on top to spice things up, because Victor, well, he needed that. And it's very delicious. And Brianna, our chat, wow, I could just, stop talking and drink. Brianna, our chat Igor, will put that recipe in the chat. We'll also post it on our website with the video. When we post the video, probably tomorrow from this show. I want to thank Tamworth Distilling and Art in the Age for coming up with this recipe. You can buy Tamworth Garden Damson Gin at Art in the Age in Philadelphia. And on that page where you go to, where they say a little kit, and I think the kit includes maybe an orgeat syrup and the drink as well. There's little buttons there where you can donate to the Rosenbach. But we are the three of us. You're drinking your tea, I'm sure, and I have got I actually have iced tea as well. Because I actually drink tea full time. Like, I just drink tea, hot tea all winter long, and then iced tea, as soon as the weather breaks a little bit. That's the go-to drink on my table 100% of the time. So, but we're not just drinking here today. We're also talking about Frankenstein, and what we do here every week is dissect, anatomize, dismember, and bring back to life this book by Mary Shelley, chapter by chapter, page by page, word by word, as we create our very own conversational annotation of the entire novel. And in doing this, we at the Rosenbach ask you to support us, which you can do by donation, or if you're not already a member, please join the Rosenbach. The basic membership at Rosenbach is called the Mary Shelley level. I'll have more to say about this at the mid-break. If you're watching live on Zoom, remember to click you can chat amongst yourselves, and if you have a question for Mary, Lauren, or I, put it in the Q&A, and we can answer that, because I can't follow both the chat and the Q&A, and drink and smoke all at the same time. It's just too many things to do. If you're watching on Zoom and you post a question, or if you're watching on Facebook and you post a question where we live stream as well, I will certainly get to those questions when the show is over and answer you. So on with the show, because it seems like maybe there's not that much here, but there's always a lot to talk about, especially when we have the three of us and things can go on. But we're almost at the end.
So close.
I mean, literally, we're going to be talking about the last chapter today, but only part of the chapter up to where we get to Walton, the continuation of Walton's letters. And we're going to save that for next week. And next week will be Anastasia for the final co-host, but also Leslie Klinger will be joining me Anastasia and I next week. Leslie, the author of the new annotated Frankenstein, which is so popular amongst our viewers, and it's my favorite annotated edition as well. So Leslie Klinger will be joining us next week as well. Last chapter, Victor got married to Elizabeth, and of course he's worried about the threat, I will be with you on your wedding night, because that means Victor is going to be, the victim of the creature. He has interpreted this. He said it more than once, that it's a threat on him. Notwithstanding the fact the creature has been killing everyone around him, Victor still doesn't think that this threat is about the other person on the wedding night. Maybe he doesn't realize that there is another person on a wedding night besides himself. So here's his honeymoon. The chapter starts out, it was 8 o'clock when we land, and they've gone across the lake, across Lake Geneva in a boat, and then they're going to stay in this little house that they have now. And it's nighttime. It's 8 o'clock when we landed. We walked for a short time, and on the shore, enjoying the transitory light, and retired. Actually, first they retired to the inn and contemplated the lovely scene of waters, woods, and mountains, obscured in darkness, yet still displaying their black outlines. But it's a dark and stormy night too. The wind suddenly blows with great violence. The moon is covered up and the clouds sweep across it, swifter than the flight of the vulture. So we've all this doom, death imagery, and tumultuous imagery going on. And suddenly a heavy storm of rain descended. This is so ill weather. Victor's frightened. 1,000 fears arose in my mind, but he's packing heat. He's got a pistol hidden in my bosom. So he's ready. I resolved that I would sell my life dearly and not relax the impending conflict until my own life or that of my adversary were extinguished. It's still just about him and the creature. It's your honeymoon, Victor. And he still can't get to that. Like, everything is about this first. And of course, you guys missed it. Last week was the worst proposal in history, in which he says, marry me, and after you marry me, the next day, I'll tell you the most horrible secret you ever want to hear. And Elizabeth says yes. But he still hasn't told her yet. I guess he's waiting until the next day to tell her. But Elizabeth notices that he's having issues here, and she says, what is it that agitates you, my dear Victor? What is it you fear? And he says, don't worry, after tonight all will be safe. And then suddenly I reflected how dreadful the comeback which I momentarily expected would be to my wife. You think? It's taken him to this point to realize, after she speaks to him, he thinks, wait a minute, it's going to be really awful if me and the creature are fighting and either I die or the creature dies. It's the self-centeredness of Victor, which has done nothing but mount as this novel goes along. I'm not off base at that, right?
Absolutely.
No.
And this bit especially, it reminded me so much of Dracula. And we talked about this in Sundays with Dracula, but the way that the crew, like all the men, tried to protect Mina by putting her somewhere safe, keeping her out of harm's way, and actually what they were doing was leaving her vulnerable to to Dracula and here to the creature. And it's because Victor is so self-absorbed, and he cannot, like you say, he can't imagine that anyone else would be there on his wedding night. Of course, if the creature threatens that he's going to be there on my wedding night, he means me and not my partner, the love of my life, who I've just married. It's that whole self-absorption and a kind of protection that actually isn't protection, and leaves Elizabeth, like Mina, vulnerable.
Yeah, and it kind of hammers home that this is a specific type of tragedy, that this isn't, I think this is, obviously we get this changed a little bit in the later edition, but in the 1818, this is very much the culmination of this as a fatal flaw tragedy. It's almost in that sense an Elizabethan tragedy, like it could have been prevented. Oh gosh, bless me. It could have been prevented, like it could have been worked out. There's all of these things that happen or don't happen, and ultimately it comes down to the scene where you're thinking, yeah, actually you're the only reason that this is happening. This is the fatal flaw, but it's going to cause everybody else around, you know, it's you, the thing is that you're imagining that you're the lead character in an Elizabethan tragedy.
And we're going to get two soliloquies later too that like really read like soliloquies from Victor. He's and bless you, by the way. I didn't want to say it like Victor is being careful now. He inspects every corner. He's like, is the creature here? Like looking all around the inn, making sure that Elizabeth's safe. And suddenly I heard a shrill and dreadful scream. I'm going to read that paragraph.
Which paragraph?
It starts with
it
she
came
left
from
me.
the room.
And then, but if you want to start it at, you know, suddenly I heard a shrill and dreadful scream. One of you.
I found it. Do you want me to go?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. It came from the room into which Elizabeth had retired. As I heard it, the whole truth rushed into my mind. My arms dropped. The motion of every muscle and fiber was suspended. I could feel the blood trickling in my veins and tingling in the extremities of my limbs. This state lasted but for an instant. The scream was repeated and I rushed into the room. Great God, why did I not then expire? Why am I here to relate the destruction of the best hope and the purest creature of earth? She was there, lifeless and inanimate, thrown across the bed, her head hanging down and her pale and distorted features half covered by her hair. Everywhere I turn, I see the same figure, her bloodless arms and relaxed form flung by the murderer on its bridal bier. Could I behold this and live? Alas, life is obstinate and clings closest where it is most hated. For a moment only did I lose recollection. I fainted. Which is very Gothic heroine of him.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's just the 1831 edition. She changes it to something like, and I lost consciousness or something like that. But she actually takes out the word fainted in the 1831. But it doesn't matter. He's clearly, you know, this is what's happening to him.
Yeah.
He is fainting. It's a sudden thing, and it's suddenly I heard it. He's away from the action, and then comes in and only finds her body and finds her alone. But the image of her lying across the bed and her hair and her arm out is so it seems so much like the image of Fuseli's nightmare painting. And this is commented on a lot of different annotations, you know, it mentioned this. In the credits to our show, there's a little picture of one of the Fuseli nightmare paintings that comes up always. It's right behind me over my shoulder over there. And that's an interesting thing, especially knowing that Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, knew Fuseli well, who painted the nightmare. And let's show that picture of the nightmare. Let me start this again. Let me share that picture with you, and I want to talk about that.
Sorry, someone's just mentioned, I just saw the chat pop up, and someone's just mentioned the movie Gothic.
And Gothic does this, yeah.
Yeah, which Mary and I have a very colorful relationship with that film.
Gothic brings this alive. They do a scene with it, and even on their cover art, usually for the book, for the movie itself. But this is Fuseli's Nightmare, and it's actually the first version that he did of it. He actually did. This was in 1781, and he did more later, including that's the Frankenstein from the movie I would talk about. But he did this one as well. And this is the one that I have in a little frame behind me, but this was in the 1790s. And essentially the painting was so popular that he knew I could paint more versions of it and people would buy them. And this one's far more demonic here and far more, I don't know, there's a real, I think this one is even creepier.
That one I think is the kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say the one that everyone kind of brings to mind, but I think the 1790s one is definitely the one that...
This is the original, and it is the, you know, this incubus character on the chest of this woman. The horse that he has come in on, with his, creepy blank eyes, is gazing through. He's clutching something in his hand, which is usually interpreted as it's her breath. He has taken her breath away. Now, Fuseli isn't just describing a nightmare here with this painting. He's also kind of painting that feeling of that night terror thing that you get when you're suddenly, awake, but you can't move, that sleep paralysis that can happen to people, where your mind wakes up, but you're still, your body, you can't move your body yet. And also, and you can't, and sometimes you can't catch your breath. But this layout of the body on the bed sounds very much like, what Mary Shelley has described in the novel for the body lying across the bed. And the connection with Mary Wollstonecraft, with her mother, is that Mary Wollstonecraft became very close with Fuseli. And before she met Gilbert Imlay, with whom she had a child with, and fell in love with Fuseli. But Fuseli was married, and Mary Wollstonecraft said, well, that's okay. I can come and live with you and your wife, and, we'll kind of be a happy, all together family. And Fuseli completely rejected that and said no, and she was very depressed over it. This isn't one of the times where she did attempt suicide, but Mary Wollstonecraft did attempt suicide twice in the same year, but that was after Gilbert Imlay had kind of abandoned her, and she was distraught then. She wasn't as distraught with Fuseli, but it certainly affected her. And it's interesting, in the memoirs that Godwin put together, when he describes Mary Wollstonecraft as a female Werther, from the Sorrows of Werther, it's right after he describes her reaction to being rejected by Fuseli, and how passionate she was. And but Fuseli also painted this, and it was enormously popular, and it remained popular. There's a lot of parodies of this painting that are people do up till today. There's even, it's still, political cartoonists will use this image and put different figures there. Anything on the nightmare painting from you guys? I'm sure you've worked with this and come across this many times in Gothic. This is a big painting for, the whole Gothic era, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the image that I would say gets used the most when we're talking about late 18th century, early 19th century Gothic. This kind of crops up again and again. A colleague of ours, Dr. Hannah Moss, did a really fantastic paper about Fuseli's painting, and not only his recreations of the painting, but subsequent recreations of the painting, both in literature and in art. And you can find Hannah on Twitter. She works on art and the Gothic. She just completed her thesis on female artists in Gothic novels. She's really brilliant.
Can I also just say that of either that paper or a version of that paper is on the Sheffield Gothic blog?
It should be.
And it's, when I was running the blog, it was like our most popular post. Just like, I don't know if you can find a link for it, but even if you just search like Sheffield Gothic Fuseli, it will come up on Google. It's like one of our most popular blogs, and it's really good. Like you say, she makes all the connections between Fuseli and Frankenstein, and particularly this scene, but she also kind of goes into the art history behind it, and the other kinds of interpretations and reinterpretations of it. So definitely recommend that.
I think she's also linked it. So Hannah does a lot of work on the Anatomical Venus. So the Anatomical Venus was a series of wax women who you could take the abdomen off essentially and look at the organs. So they were used ostensibly for surgical training. But what's really interesting is that they were made beautiful. They often had like pearl necklaces on, they had like beautiful hair. So when they are closed, they're this beauty, like, a beautiful wax rendered naked woman, but then when you open them, it's literally all their guts. And she's done quite a lot of interesting kind of papers that things like the figure in the nightmare and its kind of follow-on depictions, it's always a woman who is kind of like splayed out or laid out. The Venus is often kind of reclining, you know, she doesn't look dead, even though you can take her stomach off and have a look at what her uterus looks like inside and things like that. So she kind of talks about that quite often, that you've got this image of the female form in either death, decay, or sort of, well, essentially just a state, whatever the state of passiveness is. And I think that's kind of something that is obvious in this scene. But the way that Victor responds to Elizabeth's dead form is quite interesting, because really he jumps off it quite quickly. You know, we have this artistic rendering where she is almost unbelievably, you know, positioned.
Yeah.
But this kind of idea of the evocative image of the female distress, the female death, is something that goes back to that Burkean sublime again. You know, and the idea of the Burkean sublime, in many ways, never is a woman more beautiful than when she's dead or dying.
Yeah.
And that kind of is reinforced by this artistic rendering of Elizabeth, that, you know, she's not dashed against something, she's not crumpled, her face isn't contorted, she's kind of almost beautifully positioned.
It's eroticized, you know.
Yeah, very
it's
much so.
Eroticized version of murdering, you know, a woman. And
yeah, and what I find interesting is the way that Shelley kind of reinforces and subverts this. So women die a lot in Shelley novels, but I think apart from The Last Man, even when their deaths are brutal, the image of their death is not brutal. So euthanasia, Elizabeth is strangled off screen, euthanasia drowns.
Yeah.
But they're always kind of painted by the text as serene in a way. And I think when we read Shelley versus when we read a lot of male writers, we can allow ourselves that pre-feminist lens, that there is something of a power in women's beauty and death. It is eroticized by Victor, because Victor is the onlooker, but we can make that argument that Shelley as author is not necessarily resisting that eroticization and that voyeuristic nature, but she is, you know, she will not take Elizabeth's dignity in that last moment.
Yeah.
You know, she will not allow Elizabeth to be brutalized in that last moment. You know, she will maintain that dignity. Her last scene will be beautiful. And in a lot of ways it's interesting, because a lot of adaptations force that scene on screen.
Yeah. Well,
you know, you have to watch it,
as it does in Wales' Frankenstein. This is, you know, we get the scene where he kind of he moves in and menaces the bride, and then it's cut to this, you know, the aftermath and he's outside the window here, and the room is, you know, broken apart, and she's lying and very much in the same pose as the nightmare painting. I mean, here's the painting and here's her. It's so close to it. And Wales aware of this, and Wales recreating this, but especially here, this isn't so much the threat that he has murdered her as also the threat that he has just raped her. And
that's really fascinating in terms of the way in which we interpret a text, because I don't think in the text there's any suggestion of sexual violence, because the creature in many ways is a very pure and innocent being. Some adaptations, so the Johnny Lee Miller Benedict Cumberbatch adaptation, which Mary and I live tweeted when it was on last year, they attempt to paint a very they show Elizabeth and the creature in the bedroom, and they attempt to show a very tragic, bittersweet scene in which the creature, Elizabeth understands the creature, Elizabeth is kind of shown to be, if she'd have known, then perhaps none of this would happen, but she has to die. Whereas some adaptations make it very violent, very sexualized, but it's completely off screen in the novel.
Yeah.
There's 2 screams and that's it. And then we have this image. So I think, I don't want to get too much into legacy and adaptation, but I do think it's really fascinating when we think about the fact that this is a female writer writing from a male perspective, and to think about how aware she is of that image, because I think she's very aware. The way that Shelley speaks about women, I think she's very aware of what she's presenting. What do we get? And I sometimes wonder, is this a Romeo and Juliet 500 Days of Summer situation? Do people read this scene and miss the point and then kind of take the violence and amp it up? Or is it just because it makes a better, it makes a more dramatic scene on screen?
Mm-hmm.
It probably would be a bit boring if Victor sat downstairs caressing his gun and then there's a scream and he runs upstairs. But it's fascinating when we think about the fact that there's a very intentional element I think here to Victor witnessing Elizabeth in death, but the fact that Victor is
so extreme in the Branagh film. In the Branagh film, the creature breaks her chest and pulls her heart out. And
pulls her heart out,
beating.
Yeah. I saw that film when I was at college and I hadn't read the novel yet, and I remember them reading it and being like, I mean, it's a really powerful scene in that film. It's one of the few things that film does really well.
Yeah.
But it's so extra and unnecessary.
But like everything in that film, everything is over the top. So everything is up to 11. So it's the smart Frankenstein. Janine, there was a question earlier that I didn't get to, and I forgot to, that Janine asks, how did the creature know Victor was getting married when he made his threat? And the novel doesn't give us an answer, but I like the idea that the creature, it's a sign that the creature knows everything that's going on with Victor. Now you can work it out that he spied on him or something, but the creature and Victor are so linked, and that's the point I think Mary Shelley likes to keep making. That
though, on a practical note, it would have had to have been announced, and you would have had to have the banns read, and you would have had to have had it put in the paper. So I'm not sure if this would have actually happened in Switzerland, but in England at the time, there had been so many, I mean, they're not shotgun weddings because there were no shotguns, but there've been so many slapdash musket weddings, there've been bayonet weddings, there've been so many ill-advised weddings, and this is where wedding breakfast essentially comes from. You had to get married in the morning, you had to have had your banns read for a certain amount of time beforehand, because there were far too many instances of grooms turning up drunk, people deciding to get married the next morning and then regretting it, of kidnappings. You had lots of them where, a woman had been kidnapped from a family home and married off without her father's consent or knowledge. So this is why Gretna Green was a thing. That's why everybody fled to Gretna Green, because you could get married at Gretna Green without your banns being read.
In Scotland, yeah.
So unfortunate, someone's saying, what is the ban? So the banns is something, you essentially announce your intention to get married to the church, and the church then approves, or because you can be refused, the church can say, no, you can't get married. So this is a Protestant, believe it comes from a Catholic tradition, but this is what happens in the Church of England. So your banns had to be read weeks in advance to stop these hasty marriages. And this actually does still happen, but it's not a big to-do. So often it would be put in the paper. You would have to have your banns read 3 or 4 times before you could get married, and they had to be a certain amount of weeks before. You had to get married before 11 o'clock, I think it was, in the morning, to try and minimize drunkenness. And that's why you had a wedding breakfast, because you got married at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and then everybody went for breakfast. You didn't have a dinner, you literally were having breakfast, because it was
drinking
so
all night. You could be drinking all night.
Yeah, exactly. It did not stop people from turning up to their weddings drunk at all. But from a practical perspective, right through the 18th and 19th century, marriage was a very public thing, because you had to go through all of these steps to be legitimized. You know, you had to be approved by the church, you had to have your banns read, otherwise it was illegal. And that meant that, you know, you didn't get your inheritance or whatever it may be, and that's why you get a lot of those.
Especially with a family like the Frankensteins. You know,
Yes.
I mean, they're a wealthy family
Yes.
in Geneva. People know what's going on.
Yeah, so all the creature really would have had to have done is listen in to a sermon or pick up a newspaper. I would, from a practical, this is me coming in as a literary historian, from a practical perspective, there would have been talk weeks before they even get engaged, and then they would, like, their engagement and their upcoming wedding would have been a very public knowledge fact. It would have been very well known when they were getting married and where they were getting married, because it would have had to have been read in that church weeks in advance.
Yeah.
So that's a little fun history fact for you all there.
Someone in our chat says they got married at Gretna Green. So there you go.
Oh, fantastic.
A reminder too, if you're watching live on Zoom and you're in the chat, just remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees, so everyone in the chat can read your messages. The default is only panelists, so everybody won't be reading that if you don't do that. There was another quick question too. Well, Gene also asked, were they formally engaged already? Was it announced already? We don't get that info in the text, but it's, you know, if they're following the rules of society, and I imagine the Frankenstein family they would have made some kind of announcement.
The type of family that they are, also if they were to have gotten married without all of that, it would have brought massive shame on Elizabeth. This is why you get in sentimental and Gothic fiction all of these issues with things like inheritance, because if your wedding did not meet all of the legal requirements and you did not have proof, so you were supposed to keep the marriage certificate, the banns, everything. If you couldn't prove that, then you couldn't stake your claim. So you often had, you know, runaway prodigal son of rich family marrying someone mummy and daddy didn't approve of. They would have children together, and then he would die or leave them, and they would find it almost impossible for the family to support them because they had little to no legal proof that it happened. And this is why fake marriages is such a common plot, because it was really easy to like bribe a priest and trick someone into thinking that the banns had been read, or that, you know, the permission had been granted. So this is why the fake marriage, it's not the fun fanfic trope we know and love it as today. It was like a genuine horrifying threat for young women, without proper protection, that someone could essentially trick you into an unlawful marriage.
There's another little moment in this passage where he describes the body that really stood out to me this time, and I don't think I've noticed it before, but he says, right, he's describing he describes the body, or pale, distorted features, half covered by her hair, and then he says, everywhere I turn, I see the same figure. He goes into present tense for this one sentence, and it's a reminder that literally he's telling the story to Walton at the time. But not only that, but as he's telling the story on that ship, you know, a year or so later, whatever it is, he's still like everywhere, like looking around, like I still see that image in front of me, even as I'm on your ship. And it's a nice little, you know, moment in that description that he does that. But I want to get to the after reaction, because again, this is another rich paragraph in that he faints. He comes to, and he's surrounded by people of the inn. You know, they look they're horrified, is what they look like. He says, the body of Elizabeth, my love, my wife, so lately living, so dear, so worthy. Maybe you should have said all this stuff to her beforehand. But I also think like that's a very realistic thing, because the way Victor behaves to her and what the things that he says to her, he never says that until she's dead. But he says that they had moved her, and now she's, you know, handkerchief across her face, looking like she's asleep. Now it's they've composed the body, and she looks like she's asleep. And then I rush towards her, and embraced her with ardor. That's the only time in this novel we get that kind of arduous, literally, embrace, and it's with a corpse, which I think is important. But the deathly languor and coldness of the limbs told me that I now held in my arm, what I now hold in my arms ceased to be the Elizabeth whom I had loved and cherished. And this has happened to him before, but not literally, right? The dream.
Yeah.
Right after he has the he creates the creature and goes to sleep, he has this nightmare dream, which I brought up, and it's the just he's in this dream. It is, I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her. But as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. So this Freudian dream he has, yes, anachronistically, this Freudian dream that he has after he's created the creature is also recreated in a sense, but just in reality, it remains.
Well, it links it back to that Grecian tragedy thing as well, like it's Oedipal, essentially, that moment, and I probably wouldn't read too much into that, but in terms of this being a tragedy, it shows that Victor kind of sees himself more as the Greek tragedy. He sees himself as someone who, yes, has a fatal flaw, but his destiny is inescapable. He is as Loki would say, burdened with potential and purpose. But then the 1818 novel at least paints him very differently, and it's kind of resisting that, and it's like, no, this is your fatal flaw. This is not destiny. This is not preordained. You are the maker of your fate, and you're the one that's doing this. So that kind of foreshadowing dream, the way that Victor interprets it and the way it actually functions kind of work quite differently. He sees it as this kind of, strange, maybe Oedipal, foreshadowing, foretelling, when really it should be a warning that he chooses essentially not to follow.
Mm-hmm.
The death of a parent when you're embracing a loved one, you've just created life, and it doesn't occur to you that a dream reminding you of your dead mother and the things you want out of your life, maybe you should take care of this pseudo child you have just created. And like the kind of the way that functions is I think playing into that. Is it tragic? Is it not tragic? What kind of tragedy is it? And very much Victor's perspective of himself is challenged in this moment, but he does resist. Apart from, when he says like, oh, I keep seeing it, he kind of resists being told about himself, as my students would say.
Mary, jump in on this. We're like going on and on here.
Yeah, no, and it's good stuff. I'm enjoying listening to it. I mean, I agree. Like, obviously, his whole endeavor into creation is basically because his mother died and he was sad and he wanted to, be able to, to stop death, essentially. So it's all, for Victor, it's all linked up with the figure of his mother, and the idea of women as being the bearers of life, and Victor wanting to transgress that, and like you say, like the dream is kind of a prophetic foretelling and a warning to not do that, because if you transgress that, then this is what might happen. But it's also reminding me of this scene, I think you talked about it before, where he rips apart the female monster that he creates, and part of that is his fear that the female monster, the female creature, might also want to have her own progeny, and to bear children, and that for Victor is terrifying. it's that even more so than like the male creature.
Well, I want to come back to you on that because we'll get another allusion to that happens in a little bit when the creature shows up again, and then we can tie that whole scene into it. I love the Greek tragedy thing idea here, that kind of conceptually is maybe what's going on, especially knowing that in Mary's life she's reading those kinds of things now. First he's teaching her Greek, and they're reading aloud these ancient Greek authors, and he's begun work on his Prometheus Unbound retelling of the Aeschylus play that was lost.
Yeah, and as we said before, this is subtitled The Modern Prometheus. Who gives it that subtitle? Is it Frankenstein? Is it Shelley? But you can there's a lot of grounds for that physical meta reading when it comes to Frankenstein, which is really poignant because we are in the age of Romanticism, but what directly precedes that is the Age of Enlightenment, and neoclassicism is such a huge part of the Age of Enlightenment. So the revival of Greek and Roman art, architecture, and literature, and Romanticism is pushing back against so much of that. But one thing that it remains obsessed with is the art and the literature. Keats writes Lamia, you get all of these references to Prometheus, you have a lot of it in, oh god, I can't remember what the name of it is, but the Byron poem about the one who's locked in the thing under the lake. I know I should know what it's called, but brain escapes me. I think it's
Prisoner of Chillon.
Yeah, is it one of his unfinished ones? There's lots of these like mythological allusions throughout Romantic art as well. You get a lot of kind of revival in art. So this is something that the audience as well is really keenly aware of, and the difference between types of tragedy is something that would have been taught even in the most basics of education. So you would of course have a classic education if you were fortunate enough to be born either male and middle to upper class, or female and either very bohemian or very upper class. So this is something that that most readers are aware of, that she's definitely tapping into.
And then the creature kills everybody the same way. It's the murderous mark of the fiend's grasp was on her neck, so he always strangles them. This is obviously learned it right away. Like, oh, it's the easiest way to kill a human. I just crush their neck because he's that strong. He's done that with her, and then here's the moment where the shutters have been thrown back in the room, and I saw at the open window a figure the most hideous and abhorred. A grin was on the face of the monster. He seemed to jeer as with his fiendish finger he pointed toward the corpse of my wife. I rushed towards the window and, drawing a pistol from my bosom, shot. But he eluded me, leaped from his station, and running with the swiftness of lightning, plunged into the lake. Just like that scene in the Orkneys when Victor tears apart, the female being that he's making, and the creature's looking in through the skylight. We get a kind of recreation of that, except the dead woman is now Elizabeth, whom the creature has already killed. But Mary, you mentioned earlier that kind of the way this death of Elizabeth parallels that. You want to hit that again as I stopped you a little bit ago?
Sure, and I mean, you can also see the destruction of the female creature as a kind of foreshadowing of the creature's destruction of Elizabeth here, and the kind of his threat that I will see you on your wedding night is clearly like linking both of those scenes together, and the idea that if we see them as doubles, and the creature is obviously all he wants is a companion, someone to spend his life with, someone like him. And if he can't have that, then Victor can't have that either. And it's that idea of, doubling, that's centered on, female bodies and female, I guess, I guess women having a lack of agency and a lack of being able to consent to what is done to their bodies. I mean, Elizabeth is essentially quite passive throughout the novel. She's just waiting around for Victor to, you know, decide he's ready to get married. And the female creature is, again, like the creature, just an assortment of dead body parts that even the creation of is quite destructive and quite violent in a very invasive way. You know, it's one thing to create someone in your image, but then it's another thing for a man to create, you know, a woman's body. And I think you touched on, you know, the ideas that both the creature and Victor know what the purpose of the female creature is, and they're both happy to kind of go along with that, regardless of whether she wants to consent to it or not.
Both of these men destroy their female mate too. Like, well, I mean, the other's female mate, and there's queer subtext all over this, right? So
absolutely,
not even subtext in a sense.
100%. And you know, I mean, Elizabeth, she's married Victor, but she's essentially been entrapped because she doesn't have the full picture. And who knows, you know, if someone came to me and said, oh, by the way, I've just created this other thing, this other creature, and they've actually like killed like my brother and my friend, and there's
that child that you felt responsible for.
Yeah, and they're also maybe going to be pursuing me, but hey, you know, let's still get married. That might cause me to like think again, but Elizabeth isn't given that opportunity.
But Elizabeth would have been on board. Elizabeth.
Oh yeah,
like,
100%
forgiving.
She's great. But think about, you know, compare how Victor is with Clerval when they're going around England and Scotland, and he's thinking, I need to be near Clerval, I need to make sure that he's protected and that the creature doesn't kill him. And here he's like, oh, I'm gonna put Elizabeth in another room and leave her alone so she's safe. He's more worried about Clerval. So you can also read that kind of homosocial or that kind of even, you know, queer subtext in.
I think there's a lot of queer subtext between Clerval and Victor. The musical that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, which I think is still only available in Korean. I don't think you can get it with English subtitles, but there are clips on YouTube that plays up the queer subtext massively, and the doubling happens not so much between Victor's mother Elizabeth and the creature, so it doesn't do that kind of classic female trifecta. It's between Victor the creature and Clerval, and Victor is kind of presented as having this very passionate relationship with Clerval, and things like, you know, Clerval's love of chivalry and his bravery and things like that are played up a lot more. But I don't think it's a huge leap to make. I think it's interesting because in a lot of ways, because Victor is so arrogant and he's so self-centered, Clerval is more interested in Clerval, be it homosocial or homosexual. His relationship with Clerval is far more developed, it's far more intimate, it's far more equal. You know, Elizabeth has been essentially raised. Elizabeth doesn't have that much choice. If she chooses not to marry Victor, where does she go and what does she do? You know, she's essentially got nothing else. She's kind of stuck. Like, she kind of has to marry him, even if, and I always think, you know, how much does she love him? Because if I was in that situation, would I just tell myself that I love this person? Would I just accept that this is my lot in life? You know, this is something that a lot of women in the late 18th and early 19th century were being faced with. This is my lot in life. If I try hard enough, I can fall in love with this person. If I accept this and I make the most of this. And this is something that a lot of women are going through. You know, it's not the Gothic heroine where they meet in the church and they're taken by one another. She's basically groomed, and it's even worse in the 1831 that they're like, here, have a sister, playmate, and future bride.
Yeah.
Clerval has so much more agency and there's so much more passion, which I think, and again, the relationship with the creature is passionate. You know, it's that almost like Wuthering Heights-esque kind of violent, destructive passion between the two of them that is, I think, more mirrored when he and Clerval are kind of in that cat and mouse with the creature. And because that then ends with the creation and destruction of the female creature, and then you have him coming back for Elizabeth. I think the queer text is subtext. The queer text, I mean, slip of the tongue. It's not even subtext. Let's just say it's queer text.
And Mary mentioned that the doubling that goes on, that's again emphasized here, the creature and Victor kind of being in the same position. Something I've been talking about the last couple of weeks, and you guys weren't here at all, is that I think the novel's even kind of gone even further than that already, and that we just keep getting it emphasized. It's not that they're kind of doubled in a sense, but that Victor has literally become the creature because the creature has shaped him to be exactly what he is too. So it's almost like they're not even double, they're like almost the same kind of thing now, because almost everything matches up with them. And there'll be another couple moments, you know, later in these two chapters where Victor's not just, you know, the other side, like the other side of the coin. They're both the same side now. They're the same kind of being,
which is a really effective Gothic narrative convention. Mary can probably talk about this a bit more succinctly than I can, because she's more familiar with things like Confessions of a Justified Sinner. But this is a really popular trope that contemporary Gothic picks up on massively. Things like Fingersmith and The Handmaiden, which is kind of an adaptation of Fingersmith. Even things like Single White Female, you know, the kind of the blurring of the boundaries between the double and the fact that the kind of at the end of the text, the question is, well, were they ever a double, or were they always one being in two separate bodies? And there's because you have that element of creation here that is really taken to another level. You know, yes, he creates him out of parts, but how much of Victor is in the creature and how much of the creature is in Victor? It kind of adds that nature and nurture element to the doubling in a way that I think
no one else even sees the creature at this moment. I mean, this is easy to say, like, did Victor really see him out the window, or is he so, you know, insane with his, you know, grief and rage right now that he saw him? Because then they go chase him and then nobody finds anything.
I mean, it's implied there's tracks because it does kind of say that they follow tracks, but yeah, you do have that kind of like blurring of.
Why do you follow a track with a boat? I don't understand. Like, you're not following a track with a boat. Nets were cast, but in vain. Let's move on from this point. Because they do a little search here, and they don't find him, and then Victor says, "I did not accompany them when they go out." This is expanded in the 31 edition, and that he is so exhausted from the first trip out to look that he then does not accompany them. But he says, "A film covered my eyes and my skin was parched with the heat of fever." Now, I don't know if the phrase is in play yet when she's writing this, but certainly later in the 19th century, he's got brain fever. He has had this horrible emotional thing happen to him, and he gets feverish and delirious and can't kind of operate. And this is something that happens in Victoria, and it's actually a real thing that doctors used to call this.
It's definitely already in play. Radcliffe used it a couple of times. Austen's used it by this point. Marianne, I mean, she's also been walking in the cold and, you know,
there's some she was in a storm.
But it's kind of implied that much of Marianne's physical illness is from the emotional distress of the situation with Willoughby. And you often get this is something that I work on a lot, because specializing in war means you also get a lot of like trauma. Emily essentially has a complete mental breakdown, and they often refer to that as fever. In Francis Latham's The Midnight Bell, the hero, his wife is kidnapped. He's useless, Alphonsus, but his wife's kidnapped, and he's unable to go after her because he's so emotionally distressed and mentally put upon that he falls into a fever, and he's he's kind of abed with fever for like 2 weeks. So it's already starting to become something that that is quite popular. But the kind of his skin being parched from the heat of fever is emphasizing that physical element of it.
Is Victor closer to being the Gothic heroine or the Gothic hero in this novel?
I think we would say heroine, right, Mary?
He definitely sees himself as the hero of this story, but he is not.
No.
Yeah.
And I think Shelley does it intentionally. There's lots of moments where Shelley uses the conventions of the Gothic, I think very knowingly, to paint Victor as the Gothic heroine. Even things like him fainting on the page before, and the fact that she then changes it later on, you know.
Yeah, she noticed that maybe that's not the way to.
It's maybe a little bit too. It doesn't fit with the kind of change of tact in the second version. But yeah, he's effeminized all the way through the text. And I do use that term with a little bit of caveat, because effeminized and feminized are not the same thing. And we have to be really careful with the way that we use the word effeminized when we use it in literary history. Declan Kavanagh has written a really fantastic book about effeminacy in the 18th century that I would massively recommend to anybody that's interested in it. But she intentionally effeminizes him. She's not doing that to, it's not a gender criticism, but so much as it is kind of a rebalancing of the power. And it's almost like she forces him into the role of the Gothic heroine to really highlight, in some ways, how strong the Gothic heroine is, because the Gothic heroine makes good choices where Victor makes really, really bad choices. But also too, it's a language the reader is familiar with. You know, the reader of Frankenstein in 1818 is likely very familiar with this narrative construction.
Yeah.
And it helps set a scene, it helps create an expectation, it helps divert an expectation. But yeah, he's not. The only person who is a Gothic hero in this novel is Clerval. Clerval is a textbook Gothic hero. He's chivalric, he's brave, he's loyal. You know, even the bit where she talks about him as a child being into the romances, it's very like he's into the romances.
And then I can't help but think that that's Mary Shelley's point about a Gothic hero, is that the way she, you know, disposes of him, like that's her making a point. Like, here's the Gothic hero, he's just going to get murdered.
Yeah. They're unsustainable. They don't. Her whole thing is like, this doesn't stand up in real life. You know, it's unsustainable. Chivalry is a fallacy.
When I asked that question, Bob in the chat wrote Victor Victoria, so which is the Blake Edwards film with Julie Andrews. Let me take on my mid-break pause and plug a couple things before we continue here. We bring you Sundays with Frankenstein for free, as we did Sundays with Dracula last year. So if you'd like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website. But why not become a member? Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some programs, 10% off reading courses, and 50% off of any paid Rosenbach programs, one of which I will tell you about in a moment. But also, did you know that the basic membership level of the Rosenbach is called the Mary Shelley level? So what could be more perfect for you Franken readers to join the Rosenbach at the Mary Shelley level and help us bring the books and manuscripts in our collections to life? And I want to give a shout out to some new members, people who just joined the Rosenbach this last week. Phoebe in Philadelphia joined at the Mary Shelley level, and at the Abigail Adams level, a little bit higher, Peter from Mount Joy, PA, and Alicia from Radnor, PA. I know Alicia, she comes to our Shakespeare read alouds that I do as well. So thank you, Phoebe, Peter, and Alicia, for joining. I hope you're watching. If you are, that's great. Thanks for your support. And to everyone in our audience who has joined the Rosenbach or given a donation, and so many of you have over the course of Sundays with Dracula and Sundays with Frankenstein. Your support not only helps us continue to make shows like this, but helps the Rosenbach continue to create all kinds of programs and also care for our collections. So thank you very much. People were upset that we sold out so quickly, and then we did a reorder for our merch. There are a very, very few number of glasses and t-shirts available. If you go to the Sundays with Frankenstein merchandise page, very low stock, but we do have some things. I'm sure they just sold out as soon as I announced them, and people are jumping on to buy this stuff. But there's a few items there that, you know, please get them. It's got the logo on it, and I don't have my glass. I broke my glass. I don't know if you guys saw. I broke my glass a couple weeks ago, not on the show, which would have been funny. But I have another glass at work that I haven't gone, because I bought a whole bunch of them, and I have to go pick them up still, and I haven't had a chance yet. So
yeah, mine are still with Mary. I need to now that we're allowed to cross county lines, I will be going to fetch mine.
Well, there's a few items left, so I encourage people to buy them. But this Wednesday night, April 21st, 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time here on the East Coast in the U.S., we have a program called Mary Shelley and Her Creation. Let me share the webpage for that. And it is two filmed performances. Jennifer Summerfield is an actor who developed a solo Mary Shelley show for the Rosenbach back in 2018 for the Mary Shelley bicentennial, or the Frankenstein bicentennial. And she has now created this gorgeous film of it that I cannot wait to show on Wednesday night. And also Josh Hitchens, who does a solo Frankenstein, and you guys know Josh Hitchens. He was one of our co-hosts for Sundays with Dracula. He has a one-man Frankenstein piece that he also filmed it. So we're going to show those two films on Wednesday night on Zoom, and then Josh and Jen are going to be around to answer questions after we show them. So this is a paid event. If you are a Rosenbach member, you get 50% off of this program, and I cannot wait to have it. It'll be the last extra Frankenstein show that we're doing connected with the show, and that's this Wednesday night. I recommend everybody come and see that. It's going to be so awesome. And it's just another reminder. Next week, we'll have not only Dr. Anastasia Klimchinskaya will join me as co-host, but Leslie Klinger, author of the new annotated Frankenstein that everybody loves so much. I've got lots of little post-it notes all in this book, and I use it all the time. He will be with us to discuss the final part of Walton's letters of the novel. That should be a lot of fun. And it's not going to be until next week that we announce our next Sunday's book. I was really hoping to do that this week. There's so many moving parts and so many things to put in place for that we couldn't quite get it together this week. So next week I'm going to announce it. I know some people were annoyed at that. They're like, you said you would announce it. Adam said I'm playing with his emotions because he was all set to find out what it was. I love how everybody gets into. We had on a post on Facebook, and even in the chat during the show, everybody's guesses and what's the book going to be. When we went from Dracula to Frankenstein, I just thought it was easy. Like, everybody's going to know we're going to do Frankenstein, but of course that nobody knew, or nobody was sure. They were guessing all kinds of things. So a lot of great guesses. These guys are smiling because they know what it is. But we will tell the audience, and then that a tease. So they know what it is, audience, but you don't.
That's your hint. The fact that we're smiling is your hint.
Yeah, there you go. So it will be next week. We will announce it, and it will be very exciting, and I can't wait to announce it. And that's all I'm going to say about it. So no more hints. So there's been enough hints. Back to the chapter. I shouldn't give any hints ever, but I have. So Victor kind of has a brain fever, at least he describes that, but he's also, my thoughts rambled to various subjects, reflecting on my misfortunes. I'm sorry, and their cause. Like, and then he lists them. These are his misfortunes: the death of William, the execution of Justine, the murder of Clerval, and lastly of my wife. Like,
he was the chief sufferer in all of those situations.
Also, who is the common denominator? It's Victor.
No, the creature.
Victor.
That's what Victor said. Not me, it's the creature who you made. So, it still comes back to him, even if you go to the creature. And now suddenly he's worried about his father and Ernest. Now, he's been worried about them in the past too, his brother Ernest and his father, but he realizes that, oh my gosh, I better get back to Geneva right away in case they're in danger. As if he's going to stop it, as if he can ever stop the creature from murdering anyone. Another storm and the wind, and he hires men to row across the lake. Victor can't even row anymore. He's so exhausted. And he says, a fiend had snatched from me to me as every hope of future happiness. No creature had ever been so miserable as I was. So frightful an event is single in the history of man. I'm like, in the history
of man.
Man, I am the most miserable creature. That obviously we're supposed to recognize right away that like he's using language that the creature uses. But for me, it's just more evidence that the creature has purposefully shaped you, as he said he would do, into a miserable wretch, just as he is. Victor and the creature are the same. He says, I was left desolate.
Yeah. It kind of proves that the creature is more intelligent than Victor, because the fact that Victor doesn't realize that this is what the creature's doing and how he's going to do it, whereas the creature understands fully that this is the exact right way to destroy Victor. Like, the way to get to him, there's no point just killing him because then he's dead. The way to get to him is to dismantle everything, is to kind of shake his sense of security, and it kind of demonstrates the fallacy at the center of who Victor is, where he's so sure of his own intelligence and so certain that he's in control of the narrative, even at this point where he's recollecting.
Yeah.
There's no mention here of like, I should have seen this coming, or in hindsight, why did I not realize this? There's no, we know this is a recollection. We have a moment on the previous page where he says, I can still see this in my head. He still doesn't fully realize what the creature's done and why, and how smart essentially the creature's plan to destroy Victor actually is, because even when he's talking to Walton, he fails to really like get the meat of it. He's still not really figured it out. And I think for the reader, that's a really powerful moment and realization that he's like, I'm the most miserable creature in the world, and doesn't have that moment of hindsight. I feel like if I said that to somebody, it would trigger a little part of my brain, and then I'd look at everything and think, oh my God, I've done all this. But he just merrily carries on the story.
Having that contrast as well between the creature saying these words and Victor saying these words also highlights how hollow Victor's complaints are, because everything that's happened to him is a direct or an indirect consequence of his actions, his choices. Whereas for the creature didn't ask to be made, didn't ask to not be loved, didn't ask to not have a family, didn't ask to be rejected by everyone, didn't ask to be, all of these things. Whereas for Victor, it's all his choices. And I think that contrast is really stark here, and just makes his kind of complaints very kind of, oh, woe is me,
Yeah. There's I can't remember if it's just called Frankenstein, but I have it on the Switch, but I imagine you can get it on Steam. There's a fantastic, beautifully animated, it's kind of done in like almost a watercolor paint style game of Frankenstein from the creature's perspective. And you start as the creature in the laboratory, and everything kind of illuminates as you walk through, and it's a very bewildering game to play, because it forces you to be from the creature's perspective, where you don't know anything, you don't know what good and evil is, you don't know how to live, you don't know why you're here, and you have to try and figure out how to get out of the lab. Then you have to try and figure out how to survive in this forest, and it kind of, and then the bit that really got me is when he first gets to the village, and he's trying to give this, in the game you're trying to give this ball back to these children, and all the villagers start attacking you, and you have to try and run away, and you keep getting blocked, and it's very frustrating, and it's a really fantastically made game. But I think that is an adaptation that just really picks up on that. Pardon?
Is this an old game?
No, it's only 2 or 3 years, I think, if that.
Okay. Like somebody's put something in the chat here for this.
Yeah, it's
Wanderer, Frankenstein's creature.
Yes, that's what it's called.
A Wanderer, Frankenstein's creature. So yeah, I'll post that in our Facebook group too.
Yeah,
I have a few questions here that in the Q&A that I want to hit before we get back to the chapter too.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure we do that. Early on, Ashley asked how many years the entire story takes place. And you can actually work it out in the text, and the annotated editions usually do. And I think it goes from Victor's, kind of, teenage years up till, is he 26, I think?
I thought he was 27.
26 or 27. So that's the time frame of it. It's like he goes to school when he's 18, and then, so that's the whole time scheme of it. He's still only very young. He's about 26 here now. And the Adam had asked, going on with what we were talking about, the Victor and the hero heroine thing, but Adam said Mary Wollstonecraft has a handful of disparaging comments in her writings about effeminate men. And is there anything that Mary Shelley said about this? Does she have anything like that in any of her writings?
I don't believe so. So Wollstonecraft is very vocally critical of what she calls equivocal beings. And she particularly centers this on soldiers.
Yeah.
And she says that the soldiers' education, because they are taught to follow, to perform, they're taught to dance and taught to march, and that essentially that they are vapid and shallow, and that this demonstrates why women's education is so faulty, because women soldiers are essentially educated in the same way, and that she kind of uses soldiers as a way of saying it's not women, it's the education that you're giving women. It's a really tense subject, because the way that Shelley talks about it is wrapped up in things like the revolution. A lot of it is targeted at people like Burke, in this idea that masculinity is failing because of dandyism and foppishness, not because it's effeminate in terms of it's feminine, but because it's other, because it's not fulfilling what it should be, because it's obsessed with fashion and performance. But there is still this kind of underlying homophobic, very kind of binary gender roles element to it, which Mary Shelley doesn't engage in the same way. There is definitely elements of it in Shelley's work, but Wollstonecraft is very explicit about it, and Shelley never really comments directly on the equivocal beings aspect of vindication of rights of women. Her kind of treatment of gender is very different to Wollstonecraft's, both in Vindications and in her bits of fiction. Wollstonecraft's fiction's quite odd in a lot of ways, but yeah, she doesn't really engage in it in the same way. But also what I would say is that Wollstonecraft's criticism is heavily tied to this post-revolutionary war period, and Mary Shelley is writing in a post-Napoleonic period. So we're talking about two very, very different models of masculinity. One that is critiquing masculinity in the run-up to war, in the aftermath of the revolution, in a post-Enlightenment society. And Shelley is Wollstonecraft is directly responding to Burke and Paine and to that debate and argument. Shelley is writing in the aftermath. She's writing in a period where masculinity is essentially collapsed in on itself. Perkin Warbeck, The Last Man, and Valperga all demonstrate a masculinity that is unsustainable and that ultimately self-destructs. And you can see the beginnings of it here in Frankenstein. Victor's masculinity is not sustainable. It cannot, it's not productive. It's not sustainable. It's not, it's not healthy, essentially. So there's definite traces, and you can see the influence. But in terms of masculinity and gender roles, the difference between 1796 and 1818 is absolutely massive. Like, the world has fundamentally changed in that space. So it's really difficult to kind of to hold them side by side, because the way that Romanticism looks at masculinity is very different to the way that the post-Enlightenment in its first iteration looks at masculinity. And obviously within the Romantics themselves, there's a lot more fluidity of sexuality, and sexuality is becoming separated from gender. But yeah, it's a really complicated. I was just seeing someone say masculinity has to be productive. The idea is that performative masculinity cannot be sustained. So the idea that kind of Wollstonecraft goes into is, it's fake. It's not going to last. It doesn't work. It's just going to make things worse. And Shelley kind of does this where a man who is chivalric will eventually become power hungry or greedy, and he'll eventually become the villain, which is what happens in Valperga. So essentially it's destructive. I hope that makes sense. It's
and because
tricky one.
we could clearly go a whole show talking about that.
Yeah.
Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, deals with gender and gender difference, and is there gender difference, or is it only the way people are treated and educated? There's so much to get into there, but that was a good quick answer. Quick for us. Elizabeth G had also asked, are the changes to Clerval in the 1831 version a bit of an unqueering? He is given more traditionally male roles and seems less like a Gothic hero in that edition. And I just want to very quickly do that because he is more concerned with business, and Mary Shelley makes him more of a business person, and that's the route that he's going to go with his studies, like this commercial enterprise. So I don't know if that's an unqueering or not, but his character is slightly changed to make him a more practical, less romantic figure in that 31 edition.
I would say Clerval is in both editions a man of the time. And again, as I said with the last answer, it's more about what is she responding to. And as we kind of said before, the second edition is a far more conservative edition because we are encroaching into the Victorian period, which, whilst not anywhere near as conservative as popular history would have you think, is certainly winding away from the Regency and the kind of the splendor and the vigor of the Regency, and then the Romantic period. Those two kind of overlap. And I think that's why you have the shift to business. I mean, if you think about Dracula at the end of the century, that's a very business-like novel. So having Clerval become less romantic with a big R is kind of reflected in that he is a contemporary modern man. In 1831, he's still, to me, the idealized model of masculinity. It's just that's different to what it was in 1818. What would you say, Mary? Because you kind of understand that kind of conservatism and the more religious elements a little bit better than I do.
I mean, masculinity is your wheelhouse, so I'd probably punt that to you.
I mean, masculinity, there's always a crisis of masculinity.
Yeah.
There has been since we developed the idea of gender roles. But Clerval is certainly, in both editions, an idealized model of masculinity. In 1818, the idealized model of masculinity is still the Gothic/Romantic hero. By 1831, the idealized man is more of your, it's earlier, but Emma's Mr. Knightley. And you get this in mid-century Gothic novels. Mid-century Gothic novels often feature heroes who are lawyers or businessmen. They are modern Victorian gentlemen who perform their duties thoroughly, and that is what Clerval is doing. But we're away from a period of war and chivalry and moving into a period of industry and commerce. Clerval would be super happy on the streets of Glasgow. You know, he's very much the type of man you expect to see in a bustling metropolis, which in 1831 would be the ideal gentleman, essentially. So I think that to me is more why the change happens. It's less of an unqueering and more of a modernization.
Yeah, because I think the relationship, I mean, his relationship with Victor still remains the same in the way they're affected.
Stays very similar. I mean, the whole novel is more conservative, and because you have the addition of the kind of preordained, fated, inescapable fate, it becomes less passionate and tense because it's not as driven by Victor's choices.
Good. All right.
There's less chance for Clerval to stop. There's in the 1818, there's the possibility that Clerval could convince Victor otherwise. And that's played up in a lot of adaptations that hone in on that queer reading, that Clerval could be the salvation, that he could probably figure it out if Victor let him or listen to him. Whereas in the 1831, it's a little bit more of the, this is always going to happen. So it's less, there's less potentiality.
That almost leads to Elizabeth's other comment there, that could you think of it, and I'll throw this to Mary, could you think of it as the creature, him murdering all these people, as taking away Victor's audience? Like, all the people who fawn over Victor are now gone.
I like that idea. That's great. Yeah, definitely.
That's a great observation.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned it before, there's a bit later in this chapter where I think it's very clear that the creature wants Victor to suffer. To die is for Victor not to suffer, so he has to live. And in order for him to suffer while he's alive, the creature realizes that what he lacks, what the creature lacks, is family, friends, and romantic connections, friendly connections, acquaintances, society. So he destroys all of that for Victor. He wants him to live and he wants him to suffer. And I mean, there's a bit later, we can get to it, where there's a lot of kind of I guess, similarities with, you mentioned this a lot, Ed, like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and the mariner in that, and then you also get the wanderer figure.
Every week.
yeah, I know. But it's definitely in these chapters, those kinds of themes, that idea of being alive, not being able to die, which here is less supernatural as it is in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner or other kind of wanderer stories, but still that idea that death is not a punishment for, in this story, to be alive and to suffer is the point of what the creature wants, and what the creature wants for Victor.
I don't have any rhyme to mention a little bit, but I'll have a little Coleridge to throw in a little bit.
Great.
But let's get through this in our last half hour. I'm sure we'll go a few minutes over today. Victor returns home. He arrived. His father and Ernest are okay. Well, they have not been, murdered by the creature as well. But on hearing the news, Victor's father, Alphonse, he can't handle it, and he has an apoplectic fit, not apocalyptic, fit, and which is kind of a stroke. he has, and he dies.
It's basically like an absence seizure that before they really knew what strokes were.
But he dies in Victor's arms too, which is Victor's reaction, of course, is, what then became of me?
Can I also just say
Always.
here, poor Ernest.
I know.
Poor
What then
Ernest.
became of Ernest? How about that, Victor?
He's never mentioned again.
Gone. That's it.
His William's dead. His mother dies. Justine dies. His sister figure in Elizabeth murdered, and then his dad dies, and then essentially what happens is Victor goes off on his kind of wanderings with the creature. What happens to Ernest? Who knows?
I mean, he obviously is the one. The thing is about this bit as well is that I lost sensation and change in darkness were the only objects that pressed upon me. Victor essentially goes into a kind of a fugue state where we assume what we would now consider to be like a depressive episode or a mental break. We assume that Ernest is the one that must be looking after him through all of this. Well, Ernest must
he's even locked up though, so Ernest is even
well, yeah, but he he must be the one that's taking care of the Ernest.
I would get as far away from Victor as possible. Like, you just don't want to be around him.
I think on Victor's tombstone, I would put, what then became of me? That would be like a fitting epitaph to Victor's life. What then became of me?
Yeah.
He loses sensation, and then he kind of describes to Walton this, like, I don't know what's going on, but I found myself in a dungeon. So they had called me mad, and during many months, as I understood, a solitary cell had been my habitation. So as if he had not only already been acting crazy around his family. One point in the last chapter, he's like, I assumed the role of hilarity around them he must have looked so manic, depressive all the time to his family, but now he's just lost it after so many deaths. And
I want to read the kind of like counterpart to this novel, which is poor Ernest, who is like living his life quite comfortably, and then every now and then his mad older brother Victor turns up.
Yeah.
Victor comes home and someone dies.
Yeah. I would be like, my brother is murdering my family.
It does seem that way. But Victor finally now decides, I'm going to divulge the whole story, even legally. And he goes to a criminal judge, and he has this, he says, I listen, therefore, to the depositions that I have to make, a tale so strange that I should fear you would not credit it, were there not something of truth, which, however wonderful, forces conviction. And then I now related my history briefly, but with firmness and precision. First of all, that sounds so much like the narrator of Telltale Heart, right? Like I'm not crazy, observe how healthily, how calmly I tell you the whole story. So this tactic isn't going to work. But also the fact that he is finally telling the story like completely, and he does it to a judge. So in a sense, this is like another trial scene. I think this is the third or the fourth trial scene we get in this novel where it's justice he's asking for. Even a little before, which I skipped over, he says, liberty had been, because he's been in prison now, liberty had been a useless gift to me had I not, as I awakened to reason, at the same time awakened to revenge. I mean, that in a sense is how crazy he is at this point, that liberty for Victor means I can go seek revenge. And that especially ties in with the creature, because what did the creature do immediately after Victor destroys the female, being? The creature says, I will have my revenge on you. And Victor is doing the same thing. But in this kind of Jacques like final courtroom trial scene, like, it was the creature all along, this is the being whom I accuse, and for whose detection and punishment I call upon you to exert your whole power. the judge kind of placates him like, oh, I understand. Yes. Oh, that's horrible. Oh, but we, of course, couldn't find this kind of being if what you're describing is true. Doesn't really believe him. The lines, the frenzy in my, there was a Geneva magistrate whose mind was occupied by far other ideas than those of devotion and heroism. This elevation of mind had much the appearance of madness. And this is my Coleridge connection here, the whole willing suspension of disbelief. Anybody doesn't know, that's, we actually get that phrase from Coleridge, the suspension of disbelief. And in Coleridge, in his Biographia Literaria, he writes about how reading supernatural texts, how we believe and invest in them means that we have to take certain things that seem outlandish and mean that they're true. And Coleridge wrote that to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith. And it's very important for novels to do that. And this novel's been doing that the entire run of it, that Mary Shelley is asking her audience to, suspend disbelief because there's a semblance of truth in what is going on here. Even though it might be improbable, but it's not impossible kind of idea. So that's my Coleridge connection to this chapter. So, because he's all over it. Mary Shelley, and again, every time I read it, I think of how much Mary Shelley, like Coleridge maybe was her favorite author, in which she doesn't really ever say that he was her favorite author, because he's all over this book.
Austen does it a little bit too. I don't know if I'd have to look at the dates, but that's kind of what Henry Tilney says to Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, when he's kind of admonishing her for believing in Gothic novels, that the whole reading of the Gothic is the pleasure of allowing yourself to believe for the period of time when you read the novel that the supernatural might be real and these things could be possible, knowing full well that they're not, and that you're able to separate the pleasure of the suspension of disbelief from, and obviously she doesn't call it that, but the pleasure of the suspension of disbelief from the truth of reality, which in Austen is kind of a joke about the fact that the Gothic novel is an analogy, and by believing in the supernatural element of it, you've actually missed the didactic moral element of it, which I guess also is kind of what Shelley's doing here, because at the end of the chapter, Victor says, man, I cried, how ignorant art thou in thy pride of wisdom, ceased you know not what it is you say, which sounds like something that anybody could have said to Victor. And it's essentially what they say to him at school.
Yep.
That he's saying to this judge, you are so prideful that you don't believe this. And it's kind of the flip of like, well, how prideful were you that you didn't foresee this by doing this thing, that you've done the exact same thing. And it's that kind of, again, the reoccurrence of Victor's arrogance, that why is this, any sensible, logical, rational person, you would think this judge is, if this judge believed him, he would be terrible at his job. But Victor is so used to seeing the world from his own perspective that he's unable to consider that he cannot convince another to do this, to do the same without hard evidence.
I mean, that's such a look in the mirror question that he asks. Like, just look in the mirror is the answer to that. But also, I think by this point in the novel, I don't think Victor can recognize himself anymore, because again, I keep harping on this. I think the creature has transformed him, and Victor wouldn't recognize himself anymore in the fact that Victor is the creature, and he doesn't know he's the creature. Like, he doesn't know I have been refashioned into a different being that I once was. He keeps operating under this belief that I'm still Victor Frankenstein, when in a weird way he's not. And I'll really tie that in later. Because I think there's almost some proof of that he doesn't recognize who the creature is anymore,
Mm.
and thus who he himself is anymore.
Especially in the end of this chapter when he's talking about his rage and his revenge, you know, this is a full descent into monstrousness.
Yeah.
Well,
let's get to that.
Yeah,
because I want to get to that, especially in the cemetery. He decides nobody's going to help him, so he leaves Geneva, and now my wanderings began. Well, yeah, just like the creature, obviously. And he tells Walton first, I traversed a vast portion of the earth and endured all hardships. This is but revenge kept me alive. I dared not die and leave my adversary in being. But before he leaves Geneva, he goes to the cemetery where William, Elizabeth, and my father reposed. The spirits of the departed seem to flit around and to cast a shadow, he says. And this is a very important place for Mary Shelley, the author, as well, and especially how she used to visit her mother's grave in Old St. Pancras churchyard, and talks about, has mentioned that how she kind of learns to read almost at the by the letters of her mother's on her mother's tombstone, what Dickens later picked up on and puts in Great Expectations. And then that was a place for her that really meant communion with her mother, that she could go there and feel like she could be with her mother at her grave. It's an important place, but for Victor, it is a place where he goes and recites his prayer of revenge, which I love, and which is this is like a soliloquy, like right out of Hamlet. Like Hamlet could say this. And I even tried to break it down, and I was like, is this actually, I tried to can I make a blank verse soliloquy out of this? And it's actually pretty close, especially the first few lines. You can almost break it down into this kind of blank verse soliloquy. Mary, do you want to give some reading here today? Do you want to read By the Sacred Earth? Do you know where that is?
Oh, I can do. Where are we? Sorry. By the Sacred.
Yeah, it's the beginning of chapter 7. And the paragraph starts, the deep grief which this scene had at first excited.
Yeah.
By the sacred earth. This is his revenge prayer. We should all have a revenge prayer, first of all. So Victor has one.
By the sacred earth on which I kneel, by the shades that wander near me, by the deep and eternal grief that I feel, I swear, and by thee, O night, and by the spirits that preside over thee, I swear to pursue that demon who caused this misery, until he or I shall perish in mortal conflict. For this purpose I will preserve my life. To execute this dear revenge, will I again behold the sun and tread the green herbage of earth, which otherwise should vanish from my eyes forever. And I call on you, spirits of the dead, and on you, wandering ministers of vengeance, to aid and conduct me in my work. Let the cursed and hellish monster drink deep of agony. Let him feel the despair that now torments me.
I know Victor's all full of himself, but that's a great. If you're going to come up with a revenge speech, there it is. And it's not, he's not praying to gods or any kind of god. He's praying to earth and night and the dead spirits.
It's very Jacobean.
Yeah.
Mary and I are both big fans of the Revenger's Tragedy.
Yeah.
And the thing about revenge, though, is it's performative.
Mm-hmm.
Revenge is a performative thing, and that's why you don't have any fulfillment from revenge, because it's performative. It doesn't have any, the whole thing about revenge in most tragedy is that there's nothing comes from it. And that's what the Revenger's Tragedy is essentially about. The fact that it doesn't actually make you feel any better. But that speech does really amplifies the performative. It's very stage worthy, but he doesn't figure that bit out.
And Adam mentioned how it sounds so pagan to him, and that's my point. It's like he's not even praying to gods in that. It is very It's a very pagan prayer. And the response, and he hears a response, and it is, through the stillness of night, a loud and fiendish laugh. And the mountains re-echo the laugh. Like, I don't even know if this is actually happening. Like, we're at a point in the novel where, like, is the creature really there mocking you and laughing? And then he says the laughter died away, and he hears in an audible whisper, "I am satisfied, miserable wretch. You have determined to live, and I am satisfied." Suddenly the moon arose and shone full upon the ghastly and distorted shape as he fled with more than mortal speed. It just seems so, like, everything is surreal now. It has become for Victor. And yes, I think that the creature did do this and said this to him, but it's done in such a way that it seems like Victor is almost imagining everything that's going on from here on out.
She uses the sublime really beautifully here, because the part of the way that the sublime works is it creates that liminal space, and within that liminality, such things are possible. And often you have that kind of, in Udolpho, Emily looks on the mountains and suddenly she feels as if she can actually see the armies, marching in, and she thinks she can see the sun glinting on their helmets and their spears, and in that moment she feels it very really and very, very definitely. And this is something that happens again and again. It happens in Hog as well, doesn't it, Mary? The kind of when they go up Arthur's seat. I
was actually just going to say, you mentioned Confessions of a Justified Sinner earlier, and I think this scene is really evocative of that. Yes, to the bit that you're talking about, they go up Arthur's seat, and there's a kind of a natural phenomena when you go up. So Arthur's seat is basically like a big, is it mountain?
Yeah, technically you can see when you're in
kind of a mountain in Edinburgh,
everywhere from Edinburgh, can't you? Like,
and so you can go up it, and if you go up it at a certain time, there's all this mist, and it basically creates this phenomena where you can start to see things, and there's a lot of really great kind of Scottish folklore about things that exist in the mist, and we were talking about doubling earlier, and the idea of is the creature, I think the creature is real, but there are some scenes, and this is one of them, where you start to think, is Victor actually imagining it? Is he really mad? Maybe he's just imagining things and conjuring up voices or shadows in his mind. And that's what happens in Confessions of a Justified Sinner. I forget the names now, but there's two brothers, and one of them is kind of has this relationship with the devil. He does a deal with the devil, and he's plagued by the devil. But at the same time, the whole point of the novel is the devil actually physically manifested in the novel, or is it just a kind of manifestation of the brother's own kind of diabolism and his own kind of illness? And they're often doubled in scenes like on Arthur's seat, where you do have this natural phenomena, like here, where you have the echoes, and on Arthur's seat, where you have the kind of the mist and everything, where it's plausible that actually no, Victor's alone, but also maybe he's not. And that kind of blurring of the boundaries, particularly of the self and the other, and particularly where the other is constructed as devilish and demonic, I think it that they are kind of merging together, and the boundaries are becoming blurred.
And the place that he's in now is a kind of boundary place as well, a cemetery, because it's a life and death place.
So that is so often, the sublime exists in places of physical, natural beauty. So in lyrical ballads, he's obsessed with this cliff, and he tries to cross the lake to go to the cliff, and then when he gets there, he's suddenly overwhelmed by its immensity and its beauty, and it's the fact that no man could have created something, and therefore it's an act of God. And it basically gives him this kind of nihilistic, existential breakdown. So sometimes the sublime exists like that, but sometimes it exists in this way where it kind of it's able to create that potentiality and liminality. And usually it's places where natural phenomenon are possible, places where death has happened, places where birth happens. So a graveyard very much exists in that kind of in that kind of liminal space, which is something very overwrought.
The sublime, especially when you're talking about
Burkean sublime we're talking about here, which is what the Gothic is using, not so much Kantian.
Mary?
Sorry, I think I cut out for a bit. The Burkean sublime, especially when you're thinking about things like terror, it's constructed around the idea of obscurity and unknowability, and, you know, darkness, void, cemetery, death, especially. These are all concepts of terror. And if we think, I mean, what I was thinking when we were talking about that moment with Victor earlier, as he sees Elizabeth's dead body, is that's not a moment of terror and sublime, and that's actually a moment of horror, and also kind of one that, you know, Radcliffe talks about. Radcliffe kind of essentially, in talking against the idea of the Burkean sublime, she very much says that, you know, horror is something that freezes, and that's what happens with Victor. He sees Elizabeth's dead body, and the way that it's described, he physically freezes and then he faints, which is something that Radcliffe does a lot with her heroines. But that horror is then very different to terror, which is this idea. It expands the mind, particularly through these concepts of obscurity and the unknowability, which we get here.
This very much works into that terror concept, but perverts it, because the terror concept in the 18th century Gothic is illuminating. It allows you to understand a higher level. The terror concept here is perverting, because is he going insane? And I would argue that this sparks the 19th century terror concept, because the terror concept then becomes something that makes you question reality, and something that makes you maybe go insane. And we get all these fantastic texts of like things like The Woman in White, where it's like, can I trust what I have seen? And I would say, probably quite biased, but I would say that Shelley popularizes and really starts that, because this is where Victor really deviates from the Gothic heroine. You know, instead of the creature's actions making him go, oh my gosh, this is the reality of the world and this is the reality of human nature, he goes in. Like he buys into the fallacy, he buys into the over the top imagination, and it's ultimately going to destroy him. But I think that playing with the idea that terror can lead to madness, which you really get when you get to the end of the 19th century, and that's what people like Poe are doing. That's what Lovecraft does massively. The whole thing at the center of Cthulhu is that what has been seen cannot be unseen, that once you know, it will drive you insane. And I think that
Chambers' Yellow Book idea that like once you read this, you can't, like you will die because you're so insane,
and that is used in horror, but it's a terror concept. Because it's about broadening the mind and making you grow, whereas horror stunts. Horror stops you in your tracks and you can't move past it. So and Victor, I would say
is Victor heading toward Carcosa, or is he leaving Carcosa, which is, you know, his
your pick.
We have to run through the end of this chat. Well, run through, and that's what Victor's doing, in a sense, that he's chasing the creature now, and this is the big chase. He pursues him for many months. He goes the Rhone River down to the Mediterranean, then the Black Sea, and he says, I even saw the fiend enter by night and hide himself in a vessel for the Black Sea, and I took passage in the same ship, and he still doesn't catch him. Like how does that happen? But there is a kind of like, it's a supernatural thing going on too, it seems, that he can't quite, that's the feel of it. I don't think that's actually what's going on, but it's the feel of it for Victor. And the peasants are scared by him. The creature often leaves a mark to guide me. So the creature's running away, but like he's like I better leave some evidence so Victor can continue to follow me. Victor says, I was cursed by some devil and carried about with me my eternal hell.
And
third time in this
here's
novel,
that
right?
Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner stuff as well.
Yeah.
And the concept of this just kind of encapsulates the mariner from the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, Satan from Paradise Lost, and also the wanderer figure that you get in in stories of like the Wandering Jew and other wanderer stories. The idea that he's cursed because he's destroyed the albatross, but also that idea, like you just said, like the creatures, he's leaving him clues. He's leaving a bread trail. He wants him to follow him. He wants this to be his life, but he wants him to suffer. And that's the whole point of the mariner. He's punished for killing the albatross, which is, an analogy to the Christian story. Yeah, the idea that Jesus was killed and, the Christian Messiah was killed, and therefore the person who did that must suffer, which is essentially the Wandering Jew story. I can go into this in a lot of detail, so I won't. But just to sum up, so like the Wandering Jew is a Christian myth that's based on the idea that Jews are collectively responsible for the crucifixion, which is obviously incredibly anti-Semitic, but also the idea that there's this one person who was at the crucifixion in the Passion story who was responsible either for the crucifixion itself or just for insulting Jesus on the way to the crucifixion. And because of that, he is cursed. The whole point of the Wandering Jew is he is directly cursed by Jesus to wander the earth until the second coming. So up until this point, the Wandering Jew has been wandering for, 1800 and whatever years, almost 2000 years. It's a long time. Obviously, Victor doesn't wander for that much, but you have the idea of that punishment and that curse being kind of wrapped up in a choice that you've made, an action that you've made, whether it's killing an albatross or, killing a Messiah.
Creating a being who then murders your entire family, and I mean that's what it is for Victor.
I mean, there is that.
James Marcus says Cartophilus. Sorry, I just have to say this. This is Matthew Paris. So Matthew Paris's version of the Wandering Jew, which he technically stole from Roger of Wendover, which he also technically stole from a Latin source, is the idea that the Wandering Jew is a Roman porter called Cartophilus. And on the way to the crucifixion, he says, why are you waiting? Jesus stops because he's carrying a cross, and Cartophilus is like, why are you waiting? Come on, hurry up. And Jesus turns around and says, I will go on, but you will wait until I come again. So that is the Matthew Paris version where you get Cartophilus.
And in a sense, it should be the creature wandering here, but it's not. It's his creator who is doing the wandering here, and that's the great subversion that that Mary Shelley has done with this novel. That it is the creator is doing the wandering,
and it kind of adds that transgression element in, because what you get is that thing of like, no, and this is really popular in contemporary Gothic. Even things like Curse of Strahd play with this, that the villain wants to be destroyed. The villain is sick of living but cannot be destroyed so easily, so has to kind of invite you to play the game, and the creature leaving these hints for Victor, you start to get this whole thing of mutually assured destruction, that the creature cannot continue to live because of everything that Victor's done, and Victor now also cannot continue to live because of all the things that have happened. So they must go into this kind of like vicious cycle with one another until one of them potentially destroys the other, and that aspect of the doubling, because usually up until this point the double is either benign and it's foreshadowing, so the heroine is foreshadowed by their aunt, mother, grandmother, whoever it may be, and the double exists to try and protect the heroine, or it's the double exists and they cannot both exist, therefore one must destroy the other for the other to continue. Whereas in Frankenstein, it's that it's got to be mutually assured destruction. otherwise they will be condemned to this wandering forever. And I think that's why you start to get that real blurring of time here, because the wilds of Tartary and Russia, how do you transverse the wilds of Tartary and Russia in 1816, for example? You can't, you almost cannot easily. So this, at this point, what has been a very carefully mapped timescale all of a sudden becomes really unclear, and you kind of get into this strange cycle. And I mean, to use a pop culture term, Victor jumps the shark. You know, he diverts from the traditional narrative and something new appears, and that new thing is this strange gothic desire to hunt and be hunted, because I can't die unless you die with me. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the only person that can kill me is you, and vice versa.
Let's get through this last bit here. He is wandering. At one point he and the creature's leaving him messages. Sometimes he gets left food. Victor says at one point he says, I'm parched with thirst, and he's the creature. The fare was indeed coarse that he gets from, he's finally sinks down into exhaustion, but he finds that he's been left food, and he says it was set there by the spirits that I had invoked to aid me. Victor doesn't even recognize that the creature is the spirit who is leaving him food to continue on, and this is something that the spirit does and was called a good spirit by the de Lacys for like cutting their firewood for them and leaving it there for them. Victor goes on and he says the spirits had guarded me, that the spirits that guarded me had provided these moments. He even at one point kneels down and prays and well, first the creature's leaving messages too. My reign is not yet over. You live and your power is complete. Follow me. I seek the everlasting ices of the north. The creature's literally carving messages on trees and stones, leaving for Victor to follow. And then at one point he even, I'm just trying to find where he kneels down and prays to the spirits that are helping.
I did not weep, but I knelt down and with a full heart thanked my guiding spirit for conducting me in safety to the place where I hoped, notwithstanding my adversaries to meet and grapple with him.
Yeah, who's the guiding spirit? It's the creature. He's literally not recognizing that the creature is now his guiding spirit. And so in a sense, he's kneeling down and praying to the creature. And this is the moment where I think that like Victor has completely lost sight of what their relationship is anymore. But I think that he's lost sight because the creature has remade Victor, and Victor is now actually the creature's being, and he doesn't know that he's the creature's being. Yeah. He's so blinded by his revenge that he can't see that he has become what the creature is, and he has now even praying the creature.
And the creature knows Victor, but Victor does not know the creature. Yeah. And that kind of becomes the central conceit towards this final part of the novel, is that if Victor had made the time to know the creature or attempted to know the creature, then this wouldn't happen. And the kind of the tragic flaw is that Victor, who believes himself to be so complex and knowable, is so keenly understood by the creature. Mm-hmm. The creature understands Victor better than Victor, literally at this point, better than Victor understands himself.
But the creature's made him. I mean, and so of course he would, but Victor also made the creature, but he doesn't understand.
Yeah, exactly.
He never understands the creature.
I think that's kind of when you get this really interesting conversation about nature versus nurture, and about creation versus, creation as birth versus creation as construct, and the fact that, how is the creature so much more insightful than Victor when Victor made the creature? how is the creature able to manipulate, technically it's like, okay, well, if Victor has the ability to make the creature, then the creature has the ability to make Victor, but the creature is beyond Victor to such a massive extent, and that kind of is almost the unanswered question at the end of the novel, is what potential does this creature have that it is so far beyond its creator? And does it understand that? I think you almost have the thing where the creature knows that and understands that potential, and that's why he chooses to lead Victor off. I saw someone ask about the icy landscape. It's very much feeding back into that sublime thing. The icy landscape by 1818 is something undiscovered and unexplored, and it becomes a place of real fascination, because how does one survive there? Also because of the whole Napoleon failing to invade Russia, there becomes this real preoccupation with these Baltic, icy, uninhabitable landscapes that seem to challenge even the greatest of men. And of course, it's just because Napoleon was stupid and unprepared. But, people living there.
That's a rabbit hole I want to go down.
Yeah,
but,
that's a whole other thing.
But
the icy landscape is because, the Gothic castle is not enough anymore. Like, we know what Bohemia looks like. We know what Bavaria looks like. We know what Italy looks like. What we don't know is what we might find if we go into these like uninhabited icy landscapes. And it's kind of also symbolic of the fact that they have lost their humanity. The monstrousness has consumed Victor, and therefore a human landscape is no longer a fitting place because they are inhuman. And of course we have Walton. Walton the adventurer is in this landscape for a reason, and that's because this is the current uncharted land, and that's why Walton is taking this voyage.
Let me say too that there's actually a bunch of questions from Melissa, Tammy, Anastasia, Hamid, and Adrian that we just can't hit everything this episode if we're going to end at any kind of reasonable time. I'm going to answer all those questions on the Facebook group though, to make sure I hit all of those so we can finish this chapter. I love that the creature now has guns. Like Victor comes across people and the creature has pistols and guns, and he goes in and steals their stuff. Like he's become, this outlaw, and takes supplies of the sledge, which Victor also gets a sledge with dogs to lead him. And at one point, Victor's despairing. One of his dogs dies and he thinks he's never going to get him, but then he sees the creature off like just a mile distant, and he realizes, I can catch him. And it's just then that the ice breaks up. And I love the whole almost like natural kind of allegory going on here with Mary Shelley, that like the ice breaking up and everything happening is almost what has been going on this whole novel, that Victor has kind of harnessed and defied nature by creating this being, and then everything explodes on him and it leaves him alone and adrift on an ice floe, in which he winds up finding the ship with Walton on it. And he has this final speech here to Walton that again winds up being very Shakespearean, that, when will my guiding spirit in conducting me to the demon allow me the rest I so much desire? Or must I die and he yet live? If I do, swear to me, Walton, that he shall not escape, that you will seek him and satisfy my vengeance in his death. Yet do I dare ask you to undertake my pilgrimage to endure the hardships that I have undergone? No, I am not so selfish. Yet when I am dead, if he should appear, if the ministers of vengeance should conduct him to you, swear that he shall not live, swear that he shall not triumph over my accumulated woes and live to make another wretch such as I am. And he even goes on after that, but that's a very Hamlet kind of soliloquy, and that kind of back and forth, like, dare I ask? Well, of course you should. I mean, and it is it is the seeking of vengeance, that Jacobean tragedy, revenge tragedy thing going on here. But he still doesn't realize that his guiding spirit is actually the creature, that's who he has been guided by this whole time. And the creature did that purposefully. The creature set it up where I will be your guiding spirit. And Victor's first prayer to the wandering spirits was when, just before he met the creature in the mountains, at Chamonix and the Sea of Ice, and he prays to the wandering spirits to help guide him. And then the creature shows up. And then ever since that moment in the novel, it's been the creature guiding Victor to do everything that he has done. And every time that he fails to do something, the creature murders somebody. So I know we blew through the last of this to get, some kind of semblance of an end. Did you even get an alarm call there that like you're over? Like you?
No, it was reminding me to take my medication.
Oh, okay. Well, we better end so you can take your medication. You guys have any closing comments on the end of this novel? I'm sure there were a gazillion notes you didn't hit, because there certainly weren't.
I think mostly just that, I always kind of, the question I would always ask students is why does the creature lead Victor in this way? For what purpose? And I think there's a strong reading that the creature perceives Victor as dangerous, and he feels that he needs to lead him away, and that he needs to consume him essentially to prevent him from creating something. That the creature almost perhaps wonders if, in his quest for revenge, will he create something worse than the creature? The creature already knows his own potential to be monstrous. The creature has had his innocence ripped away from him, has had his potential sullied by Victor's, arrogance and his neglect. Why does the creature choose this? Because the creature is the agent of all of this. And we know from the creature's narrative that whilst Victor says he's a hellish creature and he has a black soul and he's a wretch, that's not the creature that we know. And I don't think that we are to believe as readers that the creature has been consumed in the way that Victor has been consumed. And it's kind of left open, and I think you can interpret it any way that you like, but I think that would be my kind of comment.
Because I push back on that. Like, the creature's the one that's murdering everybody all through here. It's like, but we get tricked as a reader, I think, to feel sorry for the creature in a way we don't feel sorry for Victor, even though the creature's the one murdering people.
And point, I do not agree with murder. Don't murder people. It's terrible. Don't do it. But the creature is kind of the way that the creature kills is not a sadistic killing. We get a lot of murdering in Gothic novels for greed and for the furthering of oneself. So in the late 18th century Gothic, the brother is murdered, the mother is murdered, the person who is in the way is murdered. And the way that the creature murders, so you mentioned this earlier and I meant to say it about the strangulation. It is a painful death, we know that, but there's no real brutality, there's no joy. The Gothic villain takes joy in violence. The Gothic villain,
he does with William. He exalts.
Yes, he does with William. Yeah, he does with William.
That does happen there. Yeah. We don't see the Clerval murder, and we don't see the Elizabeth murder, actually.
Yeah, but we assume based on like the way that they are found that he doesn't, and the way that Victor kind of interprets it. But then again, we also have Victor's interpretation. It's difficult to know how much sauce Victor is putting on all of this.
Yeah.
And I think it's that kind of thing as well. If the creature's, I wonder, is the creature thinking, I have become capable of all of these terrible things? If I am capable of all these terrible things, what terrible things is Victor capable of? How is this going to progress? And I was driven to this. What is he going to be driven to? Yeah. It's that kind, and that I think links back to what I was saying about the mutually assured destruction. the creature isn't a serial killer. He's not a sociopath. This is all a very kind of bitter, like, I have had to do this because you chose this path. I didn't want this and you've made me do it. It's not right, but it's kind of understandable. Whereas Victor's actions align much more with that tradition of the Gothic villain's greed than it does with the kind of avenging angel aspect that we get, and that a lot of adaptations pick up on.
It's a shame we're not talking about the creature, because the creature will come in now towards the end of the novel, which we'll hit next week, and we'll have we'll talk about what he has done and why he has done it. So I don't know. I mean, not to prolong this any longer than we have, but I think I might push back on that a little, that the creature is a serial killer. And the creature's reasonings are just as valid to the creature as a serial killer's would be. And
that is true.
I'm forced to do this kind of thing because I've been put on this.
It makes sense. Yeah. The terror with the creature is that to the creature, it's his reasoning makes sense.
Yeah. And does it, well, this is a question we'll hit next week. Does it make sense to to the readers? Like, do you kind of forgive the creature more for his murders? Are you more inclined to forgive the creature for his murders than you're inclined to forgive Victor for being such a narcissistic asshole?
Okay, so I think here what you have is a distinction between what is monstrous and what defines a monster. And I think that you can definitely describe the creature and the acts that the creature does as being monstrous. But I think there's always the question with this text as to whether the creature is a monster. Can we call the creature a monster, or is it just that the acts, the murders that he commits, are monstrous? And I think, I can't remember what week it was, you were talking about like slave narratives. I think it's really interesting to look, especially contemporaneously, at accounts of slave revolts, Haiti and other Caribbean islands, for example. And the way that the kind of the slave revolts that were very violent, and a lot of the islands, the slaves would go around, the enslaved people would go and murder very violently, the people that had, the slave owners, the plantation owners. And the way that it was reported was in this kind of violent language, this Gothic language, in that destructive, monstrous way. But how do we distinguish between what is monstrous and what is violent? And again, to echo Lauren's point, I also don't agree with murder. Murder is bad. But does that mean that everyone that commits murder is a monster? We can think about these kinds of destructive acts, whether it's destruction of property. I know we're talking about this a lot at the moment in society, but riots, destruction of property, and that kind of thing. Can they be justified? Does the fact that a person is committing violence, committing murder, even to the extent that the creature is, where it is calculated, he is a serial killer, but does that make him a monster? And I think that's what I would think about as we come to the close of the novel. And what one thing that I think is really interesting in the chapters that I hear, and a couple of chapters before, is I'm always interested in the names that the creature is called. And in the past few chapters, there's 7 instances of the creature being called my adversary, which I think is really fascinating. And I won't go down this rabbit hole, but maybe we can save this for
we can use on the after show too.
Yeah, because
highly encouraging, because this is something we can talk about then.
The adversary is a really interesting title when it or kind of name when it comes to thinking about like devil and Satan and that kind of figure, that I think is wrapped up in these conversations of monstrousness and what construes a monster. And you only get, there's 7 mentions of adversary in the text, and they're all in these past 3 chapters. Which I think is really interesting. But again, I'll come back to this. That kind of that distinction between monstrousness and being a monster, I think, is the crux.
And not to keep harping on about war, but that what Mary's just said is also the thing that Shelley comes back to. I just
heard a big laugh from my wife downstairs when you said
that. Repeatedly is, what is war apart from murder? And what's the difference between a justified killing and an unjustified killing? And that in 1818 is a huge question. You know, all of these people have just been killed. Was that murder or was it justified? And all of a sudden this question of like, is it ever okay? I mean, it's never okay to kill, but is it okay to kill? Is it okay to kill in this situation? How is one person's logic more valid than the other person's logic? Like, who's the good side and who's the bad side? And I think Shelley is playing with that here, because Victor sees this as good versus evil and the creature is the monster.
Yeah.
The creature sees this as good versus evil and Victor is the monster.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they're not, that one of them's right and one of them's wrong, but it's kind of that we've literally, she's writing this in a period where she's in Europe after hundreds and hundreds of young men have been slaughtered.
Yeah.
And what for? You know, they're standing around in post-revolutionary Europe going, why did any of this happen?
Yeah.
And I think that that's in play here too, that question of like, can there be such a thing as justified killing? You know,
the difference between
how
killing
do
and
you
murder,
decide?
you know, like what's killing and what's murder, and
and how who gets to say what's justified and what's unjustified? And I think that is something that she's really starting to question here, that she kind of comes to later.
Yeah. And Mary hit on that, you know, what the term creature is called. There's a moment in this where Mary Shelley writes in her draft, she calls him a wretch and she crosses it out, and then I think she writes devil, and Percy crosses it out and writes enemy. I think that's what it is, maybe. I can't remember, but there's even a debate like that she's having herself, and also with someone who's helping her with this text, is like, what do we call him at this point?
Absolutely. And
I love
someone in the chat mentioned the Book of Job, and that's exactly where adversary comes from. And I'll go down this I'll save this rabbit hole for another time, because it is quite a rabbit hole.
Well, we're gonna have the after show. We can do this too.
Yeah.
So
someone bring it up in the wrap up show, and
make
go down
a note to ask her about this.
And I'm gonna answer some questions on Facebook that I'll definitely hit those. But Franken readers, thank you finally for tuning in today. We'll post this recording on our website. And hey, if you're watching the recording, or if you had to tune out towards the end of the show and you're watching the end of it, thanks for tuning in and watching the end of it. We have a Sundays with Frankenstein Facebook group where we continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation. I'm always available to answer questions via email as well. Next week, we will finish the novel with the continuation of Walton's letters, and the creature will make his appearance. My co-host will be Dr. Anastasia Klimchinskaya, who you all know well on this show. But we'll also have a special guest, Leslie Klinger, editor, author of the new annotated Frankenstein. That will be fun. And then we'll have on May 2nd an after show and wrap up of the whole novel. And all the co-hosts will be there for that. Mary, Lauren, Anastasia, and Dan, and myself will all be on hand to talk about all the stuff that we either didn't hit or we just want to re-emphasize towards the end. And I'll try to do the shut up thing where all you guys get to talk, because I talk a lot. Next week, we're also revealing our next Sunday's book. It'll be Sundays with, and another book will be in the mix that we will start to prepare for, and that show will run. It won't happen the week after, people, though. Like, I'm not starting on May 9th, the next show. There's going to be, like, we had, 2 months in between Dracula and Frankenstein. We'll have a little time in between the next Sunday's course as well. The first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is just one of the many gems of the Rosenbach's collections. And if you're looking for more virtual engagement, head over to the Rosenbach website, check out our other virtual offerings that we have. We also have, the Rosenbach's also open. If you're in the Philadelphia area, you can visit us. We have an exhibition of 19th century Japanese sailor Manjiro. You can also donate to the Rosenbach. If you're not already a member, I would invite you to join, especially at that basic membership level, the Mary Shelley level. Mary and Lauren, thank you guys. Oh my God. Like, I could do a 4-hour show with you two. And I would love it. Like, it's not just because we're long-winded. It's just, I want to keep talking Do you too.
You guys need to stop asking me questions about masculinity because I can't shut up.
And war,
Ask them
yeah.
on Twitter.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Everyone, join us next week for the book's finale in Walton's Letters. And once again, will be played out by Tucker Christine's pleated gazelle song, It's Alive. Farewell, wandering spirits. And remember, you have hope and the world before you. Bye-bye, everyone.